Good morning, everybody. Good morning. Welcome to another great roundtable program. So I know many of you have helped yourself to coffee. This is the last call for now for coffee. And thank you, Alex, for providing the coffee this morning. Before we get started, I'd like to have you stand up for the Pledge of Allegiance. I
pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Light bulb.
Okay, I think everybody's seated. So again, we have another great program this morning. And I'd like to thank the library, Coronado Library, for hosting us and also providing the services to have this recorded live for Zoom, for the Zoom audience. We may have a little bit of problems with the audio, but we hope the Zoom audience can listen to most of this program. So we also thank Selena Villadolid and Tara Davies, who are assisting. So for the Zoom audience, if you could please mute your computer or device and please turn off your camera. You can use your chat box for the question and answer period that will follow the program. And for those in the back of the room, if you have any problems hearing the program, please raise your hand. Otherwise, I can speak up and the speaker will be on a separate mic, but please raise your hand if you have problems. So I will now introduce our speaker, no stranger to any of you, Vice Admiral Charles Martoglio, retired, will be speaking on America and the world in an era of confrontation and conflict. Vice Admiral Martoglio spent half of his 40-year military career in the U.S. Navy at sea, in cruisers, destroyers, and aircraft carriers, including command of the Ronald Reagan Aircraft Carrier Strike Group. He spent the other half of his career developing strategy and leading military operations, initially in the U.S. Navy, then for all U.S. military forces. He is a recognized expert in strategic planning and continues to be an active contributor to our nation's security, advising and speaking non-politically on issues impacting America, especially those in Europe and Asia. Additionally, he teaches master's level grand strategy and defense policy at UC San Diego School of Global Policy and Strategy. Admiral Martoglio is a 1978 graduate of the U.S. Naval Academy, and he holds a master's degree with highest distinction, National Security and Strategic Studies from the U.S. Naval War College. Admiral Martoglio is married to Darlene. Please stand. Herself a multi-award-winning commercial banking executive, who is also the Roundtable's treasurer and member of its board of directors. Both are very active in San Diego community and live here in Coronado. Please welcome Admiral Martoglio.
Thank you, everybody. I'm delighted you've taken the opportunity to join us here this morning to talk about some fairly significant issues. And I see so many friendly faces in the audience, people that I know, people that have been friends of Darlene and myself for many, many years. And I do know that some of you at the end of this are going to hold up scorecards, between 1.0 and 10.0, grading how I did. Remember, anything below a 9.0 is not good. The second part of that, though, a little bit more serious vein, is the degree of difficulty of a discussion like this. And it's not a degree of difficulty for me, it's the degree of difficulty for the world and for our nation as we go through these extraordinarily challenging times and the circumstances that we and our nation find ourselves in. So that's what we're going to talk about for the next half hour, 45 minutes or so. Then I think the plan is to take a break, and then we'll come back and do some questions and answers. So let's go ahead and start. You know, I rarely get through the slides that I bring. So I can see you do know that I rarely get through the slides that I bring. So I always start with, if you remember nothing else about what we talk about today, what do I want you to take away from this discussion? The first is that so much of what you see going on in the world is already a part of this great power competition that we've talked about before. It's competitive and confrontational, and in some regions, like Ukraine, and in some domains, like the cyber domain, it's already a war. America's strategic vulnerabilities. A strategic vulnerability is, if you fail at this, you're going to lose. That's the definition of a strategic vulnerability. America has two strategic vulnerabilities. The first is our alliance network. By the time we finish here, I hope to convince you how important friends and allies are to America and American security. And the second is our national will, our ability to stick together on issues that are vital to American security. Both our alliance network and our national will are under constant barrage by the adversaries. China is without question determined to win this great power competition, but they know they face strong and growing headwinds. Russia-Ukraine, it is the first conflict, the first war in the great power competition. It's so important because Putin is crusading. And you might remember from school, what do crusaders do? Crusaders go until they're stopped. They'll keep pushing until they're stopped. And the change in the last year or so is that now Putin is collecting all of the world's undesirables, the rogue nations, the non-state actors, and he's getting the support from them and their willingness to work towards Putin and China's goals. Our friends, allies, and partners are absolutely critical to American security. And these relationships that we have with our friends, allies, and partners have to be consistently supported. Because once they're undermined, they'll never come back. The banner at the bottom, preserving America's vital interests. There's 4 elements of national power. How do nations influence each other? Economic power, diplomatic power, military power, and informational power. Of the 4, which is the most important? Yeah, economic power, by far, because you can't be strong diplomatically, you can't be strong militarily unless you are strong economically. So, the banner at the bottom, preserving America's vital interests requires economic heft. You gotta have the money. Multinational cohesion, diplomatic side. The combined military capabilities of friends and allies and partners, and our national will. All four pieces need to come together to protect America and preserve American security. Those are the takeaways. Now let's talk some of the specifics. Oh, come on, you can gasp when I say something like this. And we're not going to leave until we talk about everything on this slide. And then I'm going to ask questions of you, and you can ask questions of me. Now, this slide I put up because it's really meant to be an impact slide. The only thing that counts on this slide is the banner at the bottom. Although in questions and answers, I'm happy to talk about anything on the slide. What is the slide? What's the impact message? This is, as of today, a list of the Washington level issues that impact America's security. Everything up there impacts our nation's security today and into the future. The takeaways. First one is, it's just overwhelming how much stuff is going on today. That is at the Washington level. There's more stuff going on, but it's being solved below the Washington level. And when I say the Washington level, I really mean our leadership. National Security Council, President, Congress. It's a huge number. Complex and challenging. Everything up there is hard, or it wouldn't be up there. It'd be solved at a lower level. And almost everything up there is interrelated to 2, 3, 4, or 5 other issues. So while it might be really easy to come up with a single bumper sticker solution to one of the issues, chances are you're going to complicate 2, 3, 4, or 5 other issues. There are no easy solutions. Huge number, they're all hard, most are interrelated. There are no easy solutions. This is a position America often finds itself in because we need to preserve that alliance network and relationships around the world, sometimes for economic reasons, sometimes for security reasons, but always for reasons that are of interest to America and American interests. We find ourselves in these very, very difficult balancing positions. Let's talk a little bit about the great power competition. The great power competition really started to gather intellectual firepower and the ability to talk about the world about 5, maybe 10 years ago. And it involved the United States and China. It has grown over time, again, because of the circumstances the world finds itself in, where it's now America and our allies and partners versus China and Russia. But even more today, because all of the other things that are going on in the world are now being subsumed inside the great power competition, where you've got the rogue nations like North Korea and Iran. And you've got the transnational threats, the threats that aren't nation related, like Hezbollah and Hamas and the Houthis. They're all kind of seeking common goals, and all of the malactors in the world are gravitating towards the China-Russia side of the great power competition. So where is this great power competition taking place? It's taking place in four primary areas. The first, obviously, is geography. Geography still counts. Land mass is still important. Now, 5, 10, 15 years ago, when Dirk and I were in Washington together, people were saying, oh, geography doesn't count so much anymore in a world of the cyber domain and speed of light weapons. National boundaries aren't so important. Well, ask the people in Ukraine if national boundaries are important. Ask the Filipinos if the South China Sea boundaries aren't important. Ask the people in Taiwan if national boundaries are. Geography still counts. And it's a part and parcel of the great power competition. The international domains. What are the international domains? They're the domains that no nation controls. The high seas, international airspace, space, and cyberspace. All nations have access, unimpeded access, to the international domains. That's why they're the international domains. And you see the adversaries trying to encroach and trying to limit and trying to exploit those international domains. You see it in the South China Sea. You see it in the East China Sea. And you most clearly see it in the cyber domain. The great power competition is really about two things. It's about governance type, and it's about economic systems. Are we talking about a democratic-based governance type? And there's lots of definitions of a democratic base. It's not a one-size-fits-all, but the bottom line idea of a democracy is bottom-up. The people get some level of vote in how their lives are managed. As opposed to authoritarian, which is top-down directed. The leadership tells you what to do, when to do, how to do it, what's important, what's not important. It is democracy versus authoritarian governance. And in economic systems, it's free markets. I actually say regulated free markets because markets aren't really free. There are rules to how those markets operate versus state-sponsored capitalism. State-sponsored capitalism is where the government determines the winners and losers through things like cheap loans, non-competitive bids, keeping competition away. And so the government determines who the winners and losers are in the economic sphere. And that's kind of the crux of the great power competition. It's how are people governed and how do you set up your economies? And you may have noticed a term that I used earlier on one of the slides is vital national interests. Well, some of you who've been to war colleges or served in the military, you know what the definition of a vital national interest is. A vital national interest is an interest over which you are willing to go to war. That's the definition of a vital national interest, as opposed to an important interest or a peripheral interest. I would submit that how we govern ourselves and how we organize our economic system are both vital national interests. So this great power competition is a term that we throw around pretty routinely, has pretty significant impact, not on just us, but on our children and on our children's children. This is a generational shift that we're looking down the barrel of right now. And what's the prize? The prize is security. and with security, which is a prerequisite for self-determination. How we govern ourselves, how we organize our economy. And that leads to prosperity. Because if we can organize our own economy and continue to do free markets as opposed to state-sponsored capitalism where the government wins and picks winners and losers, prosperity for more people as opposed to just those the government selects is a better option. The more prosperous you are, the more security you can afford, the more you can determine your future, the more prosperous you can. It becomes a good duty. Take a look at the banner at the bottom of the slide. If you leave with none of my takeaways, remember this one. In the great power competition, neither side must win, but neither side can afford to lose. What does that mean? That means we don't have to crush the opposition in a war. We don't have to beat them into submission. Because there's enough in the world to go around where we can have two independent systems. On the other hand, we can't lose to the opposition, because what happens if you lose? You're now governed by Beijing, and their economy rules your economy. Your economy becomes their economy. So neither side has to win the great power competition, but neither side can afford to lose. So what's changed in the world? Again, I'm only going to talk about a couple things on the slide, but I'm happy to discuss any Q&A. You know, in the strategic planning world, you talk a lot about uncertainty. One of the truisms of uncertainty is the further away you get from right now, the greater the uncertainty. And in the strategic planning national security business, that midterm horizon is where uncertainty really starting to show. 3, 5, 7 years down the road, and the further down the road you get, the more uncertain the future becomes. What's changed in the last 2 years or so is we no longer have the luxury of having certainty from 0 to 3 years or 0 to 5 years. I think, did we lose our speakers? I'll pause for just a second. And if I have to, I'll stand in the middle of the room.
Yeah. Can you always read the bottom line?
Yeah, because then
Sure.
we can read it.
Will do. Thank you. So what's changed in the last couple of years is all of a sudden this uncertainty starts today. I mean, I get up every morning and I go to my sources and I look to see what happened overnight, and sometimes I'm really surprised, like the Hamas attack in Israel 7 months ago. That uncertainty is now with us from right now to the future. The next 0 to 3 to 5 years is no longer, it's much less certain than it was. Why is that? Long honored security thresholds are in motion. They're changing, and they're all being lowered to our detriment. People are talking about nuclear weapons in incredibly irresponsible ways, threatening the use, talking about nuclear weapons as if it's a terrorist device. The law of war, which is all about protecting civilians, non-combatants, is being shredded. Border sovereignty, the core of the United Nations Charter, is under attack not only by Russia in Ukraine, but by China in the South China Sea, over Taiwan, the China-India border. The cores of what has preserved security and stability for the last 70 or 80 years are under significant challenge. UN resolutions, we're back to the Cold War, where a UN resolution of impact cannot get through because one or the other side is going to veto it. Arms control agreements are disappearing, and there's nothing coming in behind them to take their place. For the longest time, we, the United States, and our friends and allies have counted on precision weapons, very, very precise weapons to go after military and significant targets without killing civilians. That's been the focus of our military development program. All of a sudden, we've gone back to this conventional widespread destruction that includes large numbers of civilians on both sides of the discussion. Remember, the law of war is all about protecting non-combatants. We see rogue nations. 2 years ago, North Korea, nobody really wanted to deal with North Korea. Now, all of a sudden, North Korea is a central part of Russia's rearmament plan. Russia, again, is giving legitimacy to rogue nations like North Korea, like Iran. And then what we're seeing is, I refer to it as double proxies. You know, if you're China and you look at North Korea can be considered a proxy, Iran can be considered a proxy. It does the dirty work for you, keeps things stirred up so that you can kind of stay back and talk about security and stability in the world coming together under Chinese leadership because it's a better way than what America does. But what's happening now is the proxies of China's proxies are causing the hate discontent. So you got a double distance between those that are causing the chaos and those that are orchestrating the chaos. Because Iran's proxies, Hezbollah, Hamas, and the Houthis, are now actively creating chaos, contributing to the great power competition in the conflict regime. And they're doing so to the benefit of China, who is double removed from them because they're not China's proxies. Iran and North Korea are China's proxies. Now you have Iran and North Korea's proxies creating that hate and discontent around the globe. I don't do politics. I won't answer any political questions. I don't talk about politics at all. But one of the things that we as a nation need to think about is the commitment of uncertainty of America and our allies, the commitment to a democratic, free market world versus the capability uncertainty of China and Russia. You know, the Russian military hasn't proved as capable as they thought they were, and even as we thought they were. And China, for all its chest pounding, hasn't been in a war since 1979 against Vietnam, a war they lost. So they're not combat tested. So in the grand scheme of things, it's the commitment uncertainty. How committed are we? What is our national will to see this through so that neither side has to win, but neither side can afford to lose? What is our national will to see this through versus the capability uncertainty of the adversaries? The continuum of engagement at the bottom bottom of the slide. The continuum of engagement is how you engage on a day-to-day basis other nations. Cooperation, competition, confrontation, and conflict. That's what's at the bottom of the slide. It says the dynamic is shifting significantly to the right on the continuum of engagement, meaning we're slowly, but the last 2 or 3 years, moving towards increased confrontation and conflict. Let's talk about Israel-Hamas. Again, I'm not going to talk about everything on this slide. I'm going to hit a couple key points. The first and perhaps the most important of several important issues for America is this idea of contagion, containing the conflict to Israel-Hamas. Because the most important job of any security professional is to keep our nation out of war unless our vital national interests are at stake. Think about that. When you think about Israel-Hamas, ask yourself, what do we need to do to keep from becoming an active troops on the ground in Israel fighting hundreds of millions of Arabs that are looking to place Israel? How would you approach that task? This idea of contagion. And the contagion can be relatively local. Of course, you got Hamas and Israel, the spark. And then you've got Hezbollah. For those of you that know the Middle East, Hezbollah is a terrorist organization on huge steroids with tens of thousands of projectiles that can range Israel. Israel, on the other hand, is the single most powerful military in the Middle East. But can it stand up by itself against Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis, and Iran? And what's the impact on the street in nations like Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Jordan? The answer is it probably can't. So what does that mean for America if contagion spreads? Do we then commit troops on the ground to defending Israel? The only democracy in the Middle East and a longtime U.S. ally. And whether you like it or not, making that call is extraordinarily difficult in both directions. So when the national leadership says that limiting the war to Gaza and Hamas is in our national interest, we don't want to be dragged into a war called entrapment in alliance terms, because we're trapped in a security agreement to defend another nation. Which, interestingly enough, we're not in the case of Israel. The long-standing bipartisan U.S. policy has been the support of Israel. This also keeps America focused on the Middle East and not where we should be focused. That's in Asia Pacific and on China. There's only so much oomph in America's kit bag. It does reinforce the use of proxies in the great power competition. And it shows the limits are coming off of war. In this case, not Russia devastating Ukraine, Israel devastating Gaza. Different sources. I mean, Hamas initiated this with a horrific attack into Israel. But you have to ask yourself, as a knowledgeable security professional, is what Israel is doing in Gaza in Israel's long-term interests? Is it in America's long-term interests? I always say China's looking for opportunity. The opportunity is keeping their powder dry. You know, one of the reasons that America's in the position that we're in today is because coming out of World War II, we were the only nation that had an economy. We still had oomph and gas left in the tank. China looks out there and sees all this chaos consuming America and its allies, and it says, oh, we want peace, we want stability, but they're not doing anything to facilitate that because the chaos serves their purpose, because we're expending resources, and in the end, if it continues down a conflict track, which I genuinely don't believe it will, they're going to be able to stand up and say, we're the only nation with enough power in the world to be able to influence everybody else. The idea of China keeping its powder dry. The challenge for the U.S., as the banner at the bottom of the slide indicates, balancing support for Israel, absolutely critical to continue to support Israel, with an eye on our longer-term interests in the Middle East, containing Iran's malign intent and controlling the risk of global contagion, a nice way of saying global war. Just like on that very first complex slide that I put up. This is an extraordinarily complex environment that we're trying to negotiate. And we're trying to achieve all of those objectives, many of which are competing. But the only alternative is to say, which one do you want to drop off? Or which two do you want to drop off? And you can't make that decision and be a responsible global leader. I'm way behind in my slides, no surprise. My wife is my hook. For those of you that went through war colleges, you know that when you had a speaker come in, often they were way, way senior to us, and they started to talk too long, there was always somebody in the audience who would just kind of go up to the person, put their arm around them and say, it's time. Well, I keep glancing back to my wife because my wife is my hook. Very quickly on China. Just going to talk about why China acts. But on the left-hand side of the slide are all of the challenges that China faces. I don't mean to minimize China, but China is not 10 feet tall. China has some very, very significant issues right now. Economically, population, demographically, lots of things that are keeping President Xi awake at night. Those are listed on the left side of the slide. Why does China act? Back 40 years ago, and until about 10 years ago, about 2012, when President Xi came into power, there was a handshake between the people, the Chinese Communist Party. And the handshake was something like this: if you allow me to govern uncontested, I promise I will give you a better life every single year. That was pretty easy for the Chinese Communist Party to live up to that handshake for about the first 30 years because their economy was in such bad shape. There was all this low-hanging fruit that could be picked to improve the life of the average Chinese citizen every single year. But around 2008, 2010, 2012, that low-hanging fruit had all been harvested. And it gets harder and harder and harder for the Chinese government to continue to live up to that handshake. And when you're in an authoritarian government, if you are President Xi, what is your biggest fear?
Everything.
Yeah, everything. And it's your people.
Right.
It's your people rising up against you. China and Russia are brittle societies. Any metallurgists in the audience? I always like to ask in case there really is a metallurgist out there. There's two types of metals. You got brittle metal and ductile metal. Ductile metal is there's force, there's change being put on the metal. And I watch it deflect, and I watch it deflect, and I know it's going to break because I'm watching it deflect. Brittle metal, I'm increasing the force. I'm increasing bad things happening. Bad things are happening. More force, more force. I see no deflection in the metal until it snaps. That's what authoritarian governments tend to be like. And we are seeing some of that. Again, I don't want to oversell it. Nothing's going to change tomorrow or next year. But there is brittleness in both China and Russia in terms of how much the people are willing to put up with. But that gets me to my second point here. China acts to preclude internal opposition. That's this great repression that's going on inside of China. It's how do you control the people so that if you three are thinking about deposing me, as soon as two of you talk about it, I know and you're gone. President Xi, despite the complexities that he's facing, and his complexities are significantly greater than America's, wouldn't trade places with Xi for anything. He continues to pursue China's dream, which is China as the global leader by 2049, the 100th anniversary of the Chinese Communist Party. He also hedges brittle chaos. South China Sea, which is becoming increasingly more dangerous. Is America ever going to start a fight in the South China Sea? No, we're not. What that means is that fight is controlled by, the start of the fight is controlled by President Xi. He has the cigarette lighter to light that fuse. And he's hedging that brittle chaos that I talked about. If all of a sudden the people start getting really out of control, the tonic that authoritarian governments use to get them back under control, in addition to repression, is nationalism. Whipping up nationalism. And who is he going to do that against? US and Japan. The US because it's the US, and Japan because they're hated even more than the United States inside of China. And so when you look at the East China Sea and the South China Sea, both of those are hedging strategies for President Xi if things really get bad internal to China. Doesn't mean we might not get dragged into something in the South China Sea by a treaty ally of ours, the Philippines, because the Philippines have legitimate claims over territory that is markedly close. Take a look at Scarborough Shoals and Second Thomas Reef on a map and see how far they are from China versus how far they are from the Philippines. And lastly, China wanting to keep its powder dry. They They talk a good line: peace, stability, prosperity for all the world. Just follow us. What we do see is we see stress cracks becoming visible, and the people's trust of the Chinese Communist Party is eroding. Took a huge hit coming out of COVID. And one of the reasons the Chinese economy is struggling so much is because President Xi's correct plan for the economy is to shift it from export-led, debt-fueled infrastructure investment, export-led and debt-fueled infrastructure investment into more exports, and consumerism is failing. And why is it failing? Because the Chinese people who had all their money, I don't want to say all, but most Chinese savings is in what? Yeah, real estate. You all know that the real estate market in China is not doing particularly well. So the Chinese people see a mistrust, a distrust of the government where they put most of their assets. So they are hoarding money. Now they're saving at an extraordinary rate because they don't want to spend, because they don't see a rosy future for themselves. And what does that do to President Xi's plan to shift the economy into a consumer-led economy? It's not happening because the people don't trust the leadership. I do want to talk about this slide because, I talked about what does an authoritarian government mean. This slide is really meant to lock into your mind. When you hear people talk about an authoritarian government, why is that bad? On the left side of the slide, under the inputs, just think about yourself. All your personal data, photographs, health records, your financial records, your tax records, everything that matters to you, including all the internet sites you've been on. All that information lives somewhere. Some in paper files, some in electronic files, all dispersed in different locations. Through the miracle of technology, specifically big data, artificial intelligence, the ability to cull huge amounts of data, and a Chinese law that says all that information is accessible to the government. If you have it, you have to make it accessible to the government. Every single person in China gets something called a social credit score. And the social credit score is how reliable are you to the Chinese Communist Party? And your social credit score determines all the things listed under output. Where you can live, what jobs you can have, where do you get your health care? Can you get health care? Just look at that list. I won't read it to you. That's what an authoritarian government is. And that's what's going on inside China. And that's why the governance model is of vital national interest. This is important stuff we're talking about here. And you may say, well, I'm big and tough and I can stand up to the government. Until they say, Gary, that's true. What about your parents and children? How are they going to do if we take away their educational opportunities? All of a sudden, your parents can't get health care. Are you still going to say, I'm standing up? This is the repression that authoritarian governments use to control their people so that you three can't gang up against me, because as soon as you start talking about it, I know. want to talk a little bit about Russia. I'll kind of cut the tail end of the discussion off. I do want to talk about Russia, though. A year before Ukraine, 2021, early 2021, President Putin put out a document called the Russian Federation National Security Strategy. How many people here, some of you, I'm sure you do know, the United States puts out an unclassified national security strategy of the United States about every 4 years. Color glossy, talks about priorities, how we're going to engage the world. A lot of it is the tone of the engagement. Russia did the same thing about a year before. What I'm trying to capture here are the highlights of President Putin's strategy. Remember, this is a year before Ukraine. The number one priority was return the Russian Federation to great power status. First sub-goal was to reestablish the expansive sphere of influence, those nations around the Russian Federation, to be loyal and subordinate to Moscow. Must receive international respect, influence global events, and challenge U.S. leadership. And you can see the box on the side how he wants to do that, how he is actively undermining U.S. leadership. And of course, President Xi is saying, oh, this really does nice for me too. Strengthening political and social stability. A nice way of saying repressing the people, because he knew challenging times were coming. And I grayed out, because the third point in there was improving the quality of life for Russian citizens. Things like healthcare, education, food safety. I grayed it out because a year before Ukraine, when you look at the Russian economy, remember the economy is what allows you to fund all of the things in your strategy. People who understood these issues said there's no way he can do all three. Which of the two is he going to do? So right from the very beginning, the third bullet was thrown in there to kind of give the people a little bit of hope. Look at the banner at the bottom of the slide. And strengthen Russia to be an independent, co-equal great power in a multipolar world, subordinate to no nation. Who's he talking to there in subordinate to no nation?
States.
Yeah, most people say the United States, but he's not. Yeah, who said China? China's the real answer. This is a year before Ukraine. But what changed for Putin when he went into Ukraine? Instead of being a 3-day successful operation, it's turned into a morass. Where he is now, junior partner, becoming more junior every day to China. I'm not going to say a whole lot about this slide. Yeah, I can talk about it in Q&A, but I do want to get to a Q&A. The three-legged stool that Ukraine rests on. Putin's crusading, Ukraine's national will, and coalition support to Ukraine. You take any one of those three away, and the war stops tomorrow. One side or the other will be a victor. Those are the three strategic issues that underpin Ukraine. Putin's crusading. When and will he stop? Ukrainians' ability to maintain their national will to fight. And they can't do that without coalition support. Very quickly on this slide, because people say, why do the Russian people put up with this? And the short answer is, for people in this cohort, and a little bit younger, maybe the generation behind us, What they remember, their paradigm for real chaos is not World War II, it's not Stalin's purges, it's not the 50s in Russia, it's the chaos of the Yeltsin years, when Russia was an absolute lawless empire, prostrate economically, unable to do anything, and everybody feared for their lives. That's the Russian citizens' paradigm. So as they look at Ukraine, and you can see how things have shifted over time from optimism until about 2020, because things were going pretty well for Russia and the Russian citizens. So they knew that the rest of the world was living better than they were. So they started to get restless. So what does an authoritarian leader need to do? He needs to whip up some nationalism to keep people on my side. So I'm going to go and I'm going to take an easy piece of fruit, and that fruit happens to be Ukraine. Wasn't so easy. So you say, why do the Russian people still support? The Russian people still support Putin because they fear what happens to Russia if they lose the war, relying on their Yeltsin paradigm. They fear that chaos more than the war itself. That's why Russians are staying aligned behind Putin. Not to mention the repression, the fact that a lot of them are leaving. But the core reason is they fear the chaos of a loss more than the fighting of the war. I'm going to skip India. Alliance realities. Remember we talked about elements of national power: economic power, diplomatic power, military power, informational power. I'm only going to talk about the line next to the blue arrow. I think of economic strength the same way I think of economic firepower. If I'm going into a business challenge or a security challenge, I want the biggest economic powers behind me, because that's what's going to determine success. If things don't go like you thought they were going to do in 3 days, how are you going to be able to sustain economically and justify to your people why the sacrifice is worthwhile if you don't have the money to do it? And I stand in front of you today and say, America alone will lose this competition. We can't do it ourselves. The numbers do not fly in our favor. Numbers are roughly $25 trillion of gross domestic product for America every year. China is about 17.5 trillion. Russia's about 2.5 trillion. But going into a firefight with equal odds is not something any of us professional security people would do. You want the economic firepower of your friends and allies aligned alongside of you so that you have more economic power, more diplomatic power, more military power on your side. So what this slide is meant to show, America and our allies, NATO, Japan, South Korea, Philippines, Australia, a total of $55 trillion a year gross domestic product. How much we produce every single year, gross domestic product. 55 trillion compared to Russia and China, which is about 20 trillion. Who's going to win that economic competition? $55 trillion side. If coalition sticks together and supports each other. and is aligned conceptually against the aggressors. Every element of national power, economic, diplomatic, military, it's all increased with friends and allies. And it's pretty close to a standoff if you're all by yourself, even if you are the biggest economy in the world. Every element of national power is enhanced with friends and allies. The balance of power tips significantly towards America and our allies. Questions on BRICS. I'm going to ask me that in Q&A, okay? But I will answer that. I do want to answer it.
I'm going to skip these. I'm going to go right on to the end.
Last two slides. I love talking to audiences like this because you have been around long enough to remember the challenges that America has faced in the past. On the left side, all the times in the last 50, 60 years that America's sunset was predicted. How many times have you heard America is a sunset empire? America's best days are behind it. America will never be as powerful or influential as it has been. You've all heard that a lot. You know, the Russian H-bomb, the Korean War ending in a truce as opposed to a victory, the Vietnam War, the misery index of the 80s. You can see the things listed on the left side of the slide. America's demise has been predicted many, many times. Yet we stand here without question, the most powerful, the most economically prosperous, the most morally centered, the biggest global leader of any nation, and an indispensable part of the community of nations that stands up for the things that we believe in. We are the glue that holds our friends and allies together. And without our glue, it will quickly shatter, which is what the adversaries look to do because that's one of our strategic vulnerabilities. We have got to stick together. So why, after all of these times that America's sunset has been predicted, why are we still in the position that we're in? And I think the answer is, I refer to it as America's robustness. All of the things that America has that no other nation leads us in. And only America has this large number of issues, good issues. These are the things that underpin America. There may be nations that have 2 or 3 that are close to America, but only America has this list of robust capabilities that we can count on in times of crises. And I submit to you, this is what makes America great. These are the things that we muck with at our own peril. And this collection of world-leading attributes and our ability to sustain each for decades favors America and America's allies in the great power competition. As long as our leaders, our business interests, and our citizens use them wisely. Last slide. I'm going to read it to you slowly and allow you to think about it. Closing thought on our future. American power and America's alliance network does have costs. Isolation saps economic strength. It sacrifices our friends. And as we learned from World War I and World War II, it results in aggression. Fighting a major war devastates everything, even if you win. And surrender results in subjugation. So of those four strategies, which do you choose? Now I'm going to stop there. Be happy to answer any questions once we go to break. Come back. Thank you very much for your attention.